As Matt said, my name is Kianish Porian, and the talk I'm about to do today is step away from the framework. Now, at the beginning, I want you guys to know that this is not a talk about bashing frameworks. If it comes out that way, it's not my intention. But it is pro framework. It's just the idea of using framework more judiciously. So a little bit about me. I've been doing web development since 1998. I'm a big promoter of open web. I love everything about the open web and our community. I'm the CEO, founder of Cielo Concepts, Inc., which is a small boutique consulting firm which helps clients build awesome front-end stuff in general. Now, this talk was inspired by these few articles that I've read. The first one, The State of JavaScript 2015, by Jimmy Breck-McKye, Alan Pike's A JS Framework on Every Table, and one of my favorite guys on the internet, Eric Elliott, The Tao of Immutability. So, before we start, I want to take you guys a little bit to my past. In 2003, I was working at Staples. Staples was, at the time, they have multiple websites. One of the websites was a B2B website, which deals directly with business to business. And that site was on this programming language called Net.Commerce, which was an IBM programming language. Very old, very clunky. It did not have nested ifs, things like that. It's what sort of evolved into WebSphere Commerce, and we started moving from Net.Commerce to WebSphere Commerce. Here's a little spiel about WebSphere Commerce. I'm not promoting WebSphere Commerce. It's a shitty product. I hate it. I felt terrible when I went to get this spiel about it, because one of the first things that popped up, somebody wanted to chat with me and see if I wanted more information. And, you know, being polite, I didn't want to say hell no. But, so we were doing this. And so one of the things that you get out of installing WebSphere Commerce is you get a Monolithic App. And Monolithic App has a few characteristics. I've just listed a few here, but in general, it has the three layers that we're all familiar with: model, view, controller. With it comes a specialized structure and a specialized implementation. What I mean by that is that one of the things that happened is, as I became familiar with WebSphere Commerce, I noticed that the view, the presentation layer, had a lot of business logic embedded in it. And I had proposed that we need to do this separation. We don't need business logic in the presentation layer. It just needs to be presentation logic. And I proposed that we do that. Well, the powers to be, which my middle managers, had to go to the blue teat and ask IBM if this is the right direction for us to go. Well, IBM came back with, well, what you're proposing is MVC1, and what we are doing is MVC2. To this day, I don't know the difference, and I don't care. To me, there should be a complete separation. So basically, they didn't want you to do anything other than what they had proposed for you to do. There's also a massive level of effort for some changes. And what I mean is, every 2 years, IBM would come and say, you know, we've gone from WebSphere 6 to WebSphere 7 or 8, and we're going to stop supporting whatever version you're on. You guys need to move over to WebSphere 8. And it took us a 6 months to a year process to move over to the latest version. Now, going back to this history, it kind of, some of it sounded familiar to me. And so what I mean by that, when I look at an Angular app today, we do have the MVC or MV whatever framework. We do have to build it the Angular way. and massive level of effort for some changes. And I've taken a little liberty with that one, but if any of you are familiar with Angular, when they propose that they're going to 2.0 and they're not going to be it's going to break a lot of things that are happening in the 1X version, the outcry that happened as a result of that kind of leads to this. So it got me to thinking that have we moved our monolithic apps from the server to the client? Are we sometimes trying too hard to use a framework? Are we shoehorning it in? And that becomes very expensive. Last year, I gave a talk at HTML5 Dev Conference, and it was about building a UI framework from scratch. And what I mean by a UI framework is the CSS, the HTML, and a JavaScript framework, or not framework, but a JavaScript basis to it. And in the talk that I was doing, I was giving the example of the framework that I had created for this client, and in that framework we had used Angular, but we had to go through a process to see whether Angular is a proper framework for us to use. After the talk was done, I had a guy come up to me and ask in a serious tone that is there an instance that you can't use Angular? So we do fall under that sort of mentality that I've spent a lot of time learning Angular. I can't think of any reason why I wouldn't use it in my next project. And we sometimes shoehorn it in. Another example is I did a project for Harvard Business Review along with some of the guys here at Boku. And I was brought in a little bit later, and the Boku guys had established how the JavaScript was going to be built. And to my surprise, they had not used any framework at all. Now, if it was left up to me, I would have gone to my bucket of frameworks and tried to pick one to fit their needs. But they had done their due diligence, and they came up with an idea that you really don't need to use a framework for that. And it worked out for that project. Very, very worthy. So it always begs the question, are frameworks worth the expense? So the other problem that we're having today is that the web is moving too fast. In my personal inbox, I have 81 articles, all the weekly articles, JavaScript Weekly, Node Weekly, React.js Weekly, Web Design Weekly, that are sitting there for me to read. I have 16 hours of YouTube presentations that I have marked for me to watch. And I have 1,378 favorited tweets that I need to go back to and see what that's all about. And 75 other articles in my Instapaper and Evernote app. I'm never going to get to these. It's exhausting to keep up. But I listened to a talk, Chris Corrier gave a talk about keeping up with the web. And one of the things that he said that I never thought of was that pretend you are away from the internet for 6 months and you come back. You can probably start reading these same articles or the newest articles, and you can probably pick it back up. And you may also have an advantage at that point that all the crud have been filtered out, and you actually will be reading the right stuff. So it is moving a bit fast. A framework is born every 2 seconds. Here's an example of some frameworks. Actually, if you wanted to be honest, it's a lot more than that. Among this, we do have misnomered frameworks. To me, Backbone is not a framework. Backbone is a library. YUI is not supported anymore. Marionette is an extension of on top of Backbone. So there are some things that are a little out of date in our. And one of the things I went back and I looked at was, let me bring this up. I did a write-up for Backbone Conference 2012 that I was at, and that was somebody had come and introduced Angularjs at the time, and I went back and I read what I wrote. At this point, it would have been quite easy to roll my eyes and wonder why do we need another MV star framework. However, Wojja did a great job presenting and doing some live coding, which in my experience can go already quite easily. Pointed out that all the aspects of the framework. Being a fan of MVC frameworks, I may or may not try this framework in the future. Let's draw the line somewhere. So, it is going really fast. If this is the web, then this is us. Breck-McKye wrote, the JavaScript world seems to be entering a crisis of churn rate. Frameworks and technologies are being pushed out and burned through at an unsustainable speed. Now, he was being very nice. This other guy named Other Mike was not. It's not even fragmentation. It's fragmentation cubed. I've lost count of the number of MV Mumble frameworks I've seen pitched as a framework using foo, bar, and bath, where foo turns out to be an event library you've never heard of with 3% usage share. Bar is a templating library you've never heard of with 2% share. And Baz is a data binding library you've never heard of with 1%, making the combination useful to, I don't know, the author maybe, for the next 5 minutes until he switches to a new set of libraries. We are getting framework fatigue. Now, I'm not asking for a U-turn. I'm not saying that we're going in the wrong direction. All I'm asking is that we need to slow down. How many of you have been in a meeting where you're trying to decide on a framework? And you've gone through your basic frameworks of let's put the top ones on the table. Let's do Ember, Angular. React isn't a framework, but sure, let's put React on top there. And you spend an hour in the meeting, and then before you're done, somebody says, well, what about Flight.js? And then you guys go, I don't know, let's look at Flight.js. So it is becoming a tedious task. So you may ask, what is wrong with using a framework? I like frameworks. I've been using them for some time, but frameworks can make us lazy. I was interviewing a guy for a JavaScript position, and one of the questions, simple question, I was like, if you're going to make an AJAX call, how would you make it? His first instinct was to go to $.ajax. It's like, okay, that's fine. Let's pretend we don't have jQuery. How would you do it? I got a blank stare. That's disconcerting to me. I see that on Quora quite a bit. A lot of people are asking, if I want to be a UI developer, how long will it take me to learn jQuery? I don't have enough time to write in there for as many questions asked that maybe you should start with JavaScript. We rely too much on the magic that happens underneath. And we hardly ever look under the hood. We are forced to look under the hood when something goes wrong. So when you go beyond the demo example, when you go beyond the to-do list, then when you're trying to do something, so the fallacy that some frameworks give us is that you can quickly put something up. Well, what that in turn happens, and I've seen this happen quite a bit. A project manager turns and says, "Oh wow, you put this up. Now we can do this," and they go on this direction that you're like, "I don't know if I can do that." So, so there are some things. So, what do you get when you download Angularjs? With Angularjs, you get ng cookies, ng touch, ng animate, the dependency injection, ng locale, and all that stuff. That all comes with Angularjs, whether you want it or not. So what I'm proposing, what Breck-McKye is also proposing, is small libraries are better than frameworks. So what would I do with Angular.js? If there is a possibility of future state, I would have an ng core, and that's what you would get. Later on, if you do decide, you can bring ng cookies, ng touch, ng locale, and everything else that you want, and not anymore. And if you do decide that you don't want to use ng cookies, you can always use jQuery cookies or any other library that you want. If you decide that you don't want to use their dependency injection and use something like require.js, you should be able to do that. So the individual module library should be, and I didn't say this, Adi Osmani, I just read an article today, he coined the term FIRST, which stands for focused, independent, reusable, and testable. And that's what you want each of these individual modules to be, so that any time you can take one out and replace it with the other. We see that happening today. If you use Angular, if you use Angular today, the router that comes with Angular is not ideal. So a lot of people, what do? They put UI router on top of that. Well, that's all good and great on a desktop application, but when you're creating a mobile app or you're trying to support mobile, that heavy lifting that happens at the beginning is not ideal. The advantages of going to smaller libraries are you're no longer shackled to an all or nothing option. So you no longer have to get all of Angular and then build something on top of that. You can decide what you're going to bring in. Assembling the parts you need and use. So a lighter weight libraries obviously will equate to better performance. Frameworks should evolve into specialized libraries in the future. And you should follow the first rule, which is, this is the Adi Osmani article that I just read today. So I come from, I don't have a CS background. I come from a graphic design background, and I just happened to sort of get sucked into the development black hole, or positive spin to it, rainbow. And I truly do love development, but I do treat development as art. And to me, everything that I develop is an artistic approach. So the other day I was watching this TED Talk by a Korean writer named Young Ha Kim. I'll put a link to it here. And one of the things he was talking about is that Roland Barthes once said of one of Gustave Flaubert's novels, Gustave Flaubert, I didn't know who he was, I looked him up, he wrote Madame Bovary, and he said that Flaubert did not write a novel, he merely connected one sentence after the other. The arrows between the sentences, that is the essence of Flaubert's novel. So what that means is the starting paragraph of any book sets the tone. My wife, before she buys any book, she doesn't read the cover or anything like that. She opens it up and she reads the first paragraph. If the first paragraph is interesting to her, she buys it. If it's not, then she won't. So from Kafka's Metamorphosis, this is the very first paragraph. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. He was lying on his hard, as it were, armored plate back, and when he lifted his head a little, he could see his dome-like brown belly divided into stiff arched segments, on top of which the bed quilt could hardly keep in position and was about to slide off completely. His numerous legs, which were pitifully thin compared to the rest of his bulk, waved helplessly before his eyes. So if you start your book with a bold statement like that, you need to follow it with equally bold statements afterwards. So all other sentences and paragraphs that follow the initial paragraph work to maintain its integrity while building upon it. And that's what I think that we do. The product and application is our final novel. Let's make sure we put the right words that lead to the best sentence, which will justify the starting paragraph and create an awesome novel in the end. Thank you.